Hello again and welcome back for another streaming recommendation. I am Jared Case, curator of film exhibitions at the Dryden Theater and the George Eastman Museum. And I am lucky enough to have another special guest, another graduate of the L. Jeffrey Selznick School of Film Preservation from the year 2003. Please welcome Brent Phillips.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here, Jared.
Now, you have the distinction of already having been referenced in these conversations because Kelly Chisholm, who is a graduate in my class, mentioned the book that you published. It just so happens it looks like it's right behind you.
Yeah, just strategically placed there, yeah.
Also relevant to the conversation we're going to have today, so I think it all ties in nicely. You are down at the Rockefeller Archive Center. Can you tell us a little bit about your position there and what you're doing?
Sure. The Rockefeller Archive Center is in Sleepy Hollow, New York, and we are a repository for the study of philanthropy in America and around the world. We have, of course, the archives of the Rockefeller family and their organizations like Rockefeller Foundation, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, but we also have all these other large philanthropic organizations who have given us their archives, like the Ford Foundation or the Commonwealth Fund or Asia Society. And so we are open to the public by appointment, not right now, unfortunately, because of the pandemic, but people come from all around to study these archives. And I am the Audiovisual Archivist at the RAC. And so my job is to make the film, video, and sound recordings accessible. I would say our collection AV material is roughly 80% unique. So therefore, we cannot just provide access to the original. Everything must be preserved and digitized to the best quality we can. And so we can make it accessible to the researchers. So that is primarily what I do. I also get to do a little bit of teaching. We have a great education department, which I love. We bring kids from local schools in and from 3rd grade and 5th grade, and we get to show them how we preserve our history, why it's important for us to preserve our history and everybody's history, not just a select few. It's quite amazing to watch these young brains just sort of like grappling with, wait, how did that get on my phone? How could I watch that so easily when they see actually the whole process that goes into place for us being able to make this material accessible? So it's quite a thrilling job, and I love our collections.
Tell me a little bit about the collections, because I get the sense from outside that when we're talking about the Rockefeller Archive, there's a lot of paper material, but you do have an audiovisual collection. Can you tell me about the size and what constitutes the members of that collection?
Sure. Virtually every collection that we have has some form of audiovisual material within it. And as I like to say, there used to be a bit of a hierarchy in many repositories where the papers were processed and researchers got them, but all of those lagging videotapes and audio recordings and audio reels, they just sort of like stayed in a box somewhere. Mm-hmm. And which is really quite depressing because, as I like to say, the paper, it basically reinforces the audio material, and the audiovisual material reinforces the paper. The two of them work together. And by lopping off one group just because of their material type, we've actually done a disservice, or many archives do a disservice, because we're only giving the researcher half of the information. So a lot of the collections would have, say, if a conference was held, and they would be in the 70s or 80s putting down audio cassettes to record that conference. And so a lot of the material is relevant to the specific organization that it belongs to. We do have a lot of films. Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation created wonderful films on educational purposes based on what their organizations were doing, whether it was eradicating disease or agriculture around the world. And so these films were made to sort of promote what they were doing. And I can only say researchers get very, very, very excited when they've asked for something and we digitize it and they get to hear like a physicist or a scientist discussing something for the first time ever on a radio broadcast that doesn't exist someplace else. And they're like, has anyone else ever heard this before? I'm like, you probably are the first since this radio broadcast or since this conference. And so it's very exciting to bring this primary source material to researchers.
And do you have in-house digitization services, or do you have to send it out?
Both. We have a very good audio transfer station. So I can, if somebody has requested a few audio cassettes and they're in good condition, we can preserve them in-house, whether it's audio reel or audio cassette, we can preserve them in-house to preservation quality standards. However, usually within an archive, there will be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of audio reels or audio cassettes. And so we do use third-party vendors for that, just because it is exceptionally time-consuming. As you would know, one 60-minute audio cassette, by the time you go through inspection, sound levels, transferring it in real time, finalizing it, getting it put up onto the server, you're talking 1 hour turns easily into 5 to 6 hours, and that's your whole day for one tape. So we do some in-house. We also, if the films are in good enough quality, we have a really gentle Steenbeck machine in which I will bring a researcher down and I will show them a film that hasn't possibly been digitized yet.
And it's been 17 years now. We were just talking about this before, before we got recording. Is there anything that you still use from your year here at Selznick School in your daily day-to-day?
My daily day-to-day, and I say this in all seriousness, every single day I think of something that I learned at the Selznick School. The Selznick School, I've always, in my brain, I recognize that it was like the pinnacle. It was like the gold standard of how things can be done and should be done. And then you go out into the real world and you're like, oh, this is not exactly how every place is set up. And I was at New York University Special Collections for 13 years before I started at the Rockefeller Archive Center 5 years ago, or 4 years ago. And so I recognized early on, there was the gold standard at the Selznick School, at the George Eastman Museum. And then there's absolutely not, you will not be able to sleep at night if you do it as badly as this. And somewhere in between, based on time, on staff, on budget, you find that place in the center where you know you're working at a level that you can feel like you're doing your best work. And it really, of course, we learned all the techniques and everything at Selznick. It was more or less the practice of the ethics that go along with the profession that I take with me on a daily basis. Every bit of ethical concern that goes into our profession is what I think of every day. And I hear voices, I hear Anthony's voice or Ed Stratman's voice, and I'm always like, you know, that what would Ed do kind of comes into a lot.
And we should also mention, if there are any prospective Selznick students watching this, that there is an agreement between the Rockefeller Archive Center and the Selznick School to have a student go down there and do a little bit of an internship. Yeah,
actually, it's not an internship, it's a fellowship. So it's a 10-week paid fellowship for for a graduate of the George Eastman Museum program, the Selznick School. And basically it's because I recognized, and everybody in the profession recognizes, that when you leave school, it can stop. And hopefully having these 10 weeks after graduation where you're actually working in an archive, maybe of a different type than what you were used to, as we had already mentioned, it's very much paper-based and stuff at the Rockefeller Archive Center. So it's not a film archive. And they get 10 weeks of exploring all the other departments and how the operation works. And it just hopefully makes this bridge where they get another understanding of how an archive can work in the real world. And I have said this, the fellows that come, I am always amazed at just how, their eagerness and their talent just meshes so perfectly with the rest of the staff of the Archive Center. And everybody loves having the fellows come and work with us.
So in the effort to get a smooth transition from one to the other, is there any connection between your work at the Rockefeller and Charles Walters that we might be able to use as connective tissue?
No and yes. That was, you're right. There's not that big of a segue there for you, is there? Actually, once I realized, and this was when I was at New York University, that I wrote the Charles Walters book. Charles Walters, the director who made Hollywood Dance, University Press of Kentucky, available on Amazon. I recognized that I saw how, oh, what am I thinking of? That people study things only because there's a book. Like when you study Charles Walters, his film oeuvre that he basically worked in the most was musicals. And when you go to film class, you're going to study musicals and you're going to look at Busby Berkeley, Vincent Minnelli, maybe Stanley Donen. And so those are the people you looked at because there had already been scholarship on them. And right. Charles Walters was one of those people who had an amazing career, a lengthy career, as both a director and a choreographer, and sometimes both. But he had been forgotten. He didn't write about himself. He didn't have a family when he died. And so his story, when he passed away in the early 1980s, it just disappeared. And I just thought I wanted to go and piece together his story and put it out there so that people can start studying the work that he did and why his imprint also on the film musical was so important.
I think that is a basic through line for the way that a lot of projects start. It's write the book that you want to read or make the film that you want to see. Yes. Because if you don't do it, then who else out there is going to do it?
Yes, exactly. And it was obviously a labor of love, but that's exactly it. Somebody said to me once, if you had $1 million and you didn't have to work, what would you do? And I said, I've always wanted to write this book. I wanted to learn more about Charles Walters and write his life story. And they're like, you can do that even without having to work. And so I was like, you're right, I can. So it was also thrilling for me as an archivist to become a researcher, right, and to go to the various archives and dig into these archives and to see how to use them. And it's actually made me a better archivist, I think, being a researcher.
Sure, once you do these use cases as a client, you can see what works and what problems there are.
Yes. I empathize a lot with research, a lot more maybe.
So the film that you're recommending for us today was directed by Charles Walters. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Summer Stock?
Sure. Well, Summer Stock, again, right behind me there. Summer Stock is a musical that was released by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Studios in August of 1950. It stars Judy Garland, Gene Kelly, and has this wonderfully fun supporting cast of Phil Silvers and Eddie Bracken and Marjorie Main and Gloria DeHaven. And it's one of those films that I've chosen it, I will say, just because let's just all agree that 2020 wasn't the greatest of years. And that escapism in the movies is something that we do and that we love. And this is a musical. And people sometimes forget just how wildly popular musicals were in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, especially during darker times, during the Great Depression, during World War II, where people went to the movies to escape their problems. And so even though 2021, we're hoping for a turnaround, let's allow people to sit down and just watch a fun, joyful movie that could maybe take them out of their problems for a while. The film, I mentioned, it was released by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. For those people who don't know, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, not only being the premier movie company during the 30s, 40s, and into the 50s, but also the premier movie company for musicals. When you think about Meet Me in St. Louis, Easter Parade, Singing in the Rain, American in Paris, Gigi, all those great musicals were produced at one studio and by one producer, Arthur Freed, and they get a lot of importance. Summer Stock, however, is not an Arthur Freed production, even though it has MGM's two big musical talents, Gene Kelly and Judy Garland. It was Joseph Pasternak who produced this film. And Joseph Pasternak had another unit at MGM to make musicals. And his films were much smaller, a little bit, maybe a bit sweeter. He enjoyed nice people who lived in charming villages and quaint small towns. And he liked operetta, and he championed sopranos like Deanna Durbin and Jane Powell. And his films aren't taken quite as, they're not quite looked at quite in the same vein as the Arthur Freed musicals. But Summer Stock, as far as I'm concerned, it becomes this film where Gene Kelly, it's dismissed because they say, oh, it's this little farmyard musical that he made after he did Arthur Freed's On the Town, which was very innovative and was taking the film musical into this wonderful direction. And then after Summer Stock, he did An American in Paris, which of course they just threw Oscars at it because it was so innovative and so acclaimed. And so they kind of say, oh, this is that little film that Gene Kelly made. And then for Judy Garland, she had recently been removed from Arthur Freed's multi-million-dollar screen adaptation of the Broadway musical hit Annie Get Your Gun. And so everybody's like, oh, this is Judy Garland's little fallback film. And as far as I'm concerned, all of that might be true, but when you watch Summer Stock, and under the very eloquent care of director Charles Walters, and we will talk about him more, I really think that there's more heart in Summer Stock, there's more emotional connection, and it's just full of charm. So it's not at the scale and import of those other big musicals, but it certainly is one that to me is full of heart.
Well, why don't we go through the plot a little bit so the audience can get a sense of what they should expect when they get this film.
Okay, not many people who made this film were very raring to go on the plot. Chuck Walters even went so far as to try to do an entire rewrite of the script before they started it. But it's the story of Jane Falberry, who is a struggling female farmer. Her sister, Abigail, has run off to be an actress in New York. And all of a sudden, Jane realizes she doesn't have anybody to work on the farm. Abigail is now in New York and is about ready to star in a new Broadway show, but it needs to try out of town. So she brings the whole troupe back to do it in Jane's barn. So it's kind of a throwback to the Mickey movies of the early 1940s, late 30s. Let's put on a big show in the barn. And basically coming with that troupe is Gene Kelly, who is the director choreographer of this upcoming Broadway musical. And Jane allows the troupe to stay there because she needs people to help. And so she has the chorus boys and chorus girls trying to help her with the chores, which ends up being more problems than probably worth it. So that's basically the gist of it. But I will say, when I talk about the emotional center to this movie, when the film was released in the United Kingdom and overseas, the word summer stock, that's an American phrase, summer stock. And so that wouldn't have meant anything. So they actually renamed the film If You Feel Like Singing, which is Judy Garland's first song in the film. And basically the whole film is about Judy Garland's character, this struggling female farmer, finding her voice. She's always been sort of subservient to her fiance and subservient to this person. She's never been one to really find her own voice. And through having the barn, the people there putting on the show in the barn, she starts pulling out of that role and finding her own. And she finds that she, if you feel like singing, sing, and she does. And of course, she goes from subservient to star attraction by the end. No spoilers there. I'm sure people could figure that one out. But that's basically the emotional arc that Judy Garland's character goes on. And she was at a mature place in her career that she could really also bring the acting chops to such an arc there into her character.
Well, as you mentioned, Gene Kelly certainly wasn't done, and that he did American in Paris just the next year, but it was 4 years before Judy was in A Star Is Born, which is probably one of her greatest performances.
Yes, yes. This, we should say, is the very last movie that Judy Garland made at MGM after being there under contract for about 16 years. And it was one of those films that nobody in particular wanted to make. It's really a testament to the studio system. Judy Garland had to give 2 films to the studio every year. And when she left, when she was removed from Annie Get Your Gun, she went to a hospital to get herself to get her health back in order, to get off the prescription medications that she was on. And Gene Kelly didn't want to do this film, but he did it because he was a very good friend of Judy's. The two of Gene Kelly's first movie ever was For Me and My Gal, starring opposite Judy Garland, 8 years prior. And so she helped him through that, and he recognized that she was going through a dark time in her life at that time, and he wanted to reciprocate. And it shows in the film. His performance is so genteel and generous, and it's lovely actually to see Gene Kelly playing that role, which he doesn't always play in all of his movies.
And I think we've learned over the years that, particularly with big star dancers like Gene Kelly and Fred Astaire, they would often do a lot of their own choreography for the film. So they would sort of doing double duty in that they're starring and also coming up with the choreography. But correct me if I'm wrong, Charles Walters started out as a choreographer, is that right?
That is right. He started off as a dancer. He was on Broadway and had quite a few hits on Broadway, segued into doing choreography, and that's what brought him to Hollywood, was to be a choreographer at MGM. And sometimes it doesn't even have to be choreography. If you think of the Trolley song from Meet Me in St. Louis, it's just very inventive staging and movement for the people to do to, really showcase a song and a talent. And so he did that up until recently. And actually in Summerstock, the choreography is listed as being Nick Castle. And yes, he did do a lot of it. Get Happy, which we could talk about later, Judy Garland's big number in this, was choreographed by Chuck Walters, even though he gets no credit for it. And of course, what I think is one of Gene Kelly's greatest, most innovative dance sequences, which is the one he does with the newspaper and the squeaky board in the barn, that was his choreography. But nobody was clamoring for credit back then, or not everybody was. But certainly Chuck Walters and Gene Kelly recognized that it was more about everybody contributing. And that's really what I think made the MGM musical so inventive, was you had all these talented people throwing their talents together, and it just kind of kept on building and building.
Yeah, I've realized recently, going through some of these films recommended by people, that I just love seeing these character actors that appear on screen. And a lot of them went on to more fame and stardom in television than they did on the screen. But I wonder how much easier it would have been if that Phil Silvers character had not been there. He was just kind of a jerk.
Let's just say it is good that he was there, because one of the things that happened in production was people always talk about this film as it ran for months over, and it was all because of Judy's problems, and it took them 6, 8 months, 8 months, 10 months to film this, which is all pretty much nonsense. But one of the reasons that the film ran for so long was because at the very end, they thought, we need to do a bigger show. And they were gonna end the whole movie with Judy Garland and Gene Kelly doing the hillbilly number, Heavenly Music, with all the yapping dogs and stuff. And because Judy Garland and Gene Kelly had finished The Pirate a few years earlier with Be a Clown, and she had recently done We're a Couple of Swells with Fred Astaire and Easter Parade. So this sort of baggy pants comedy musical number was right up there. And they thought that'll be a great showcase for the two of them at the end. And basically Judy, she kind of opted out of it. She was like, I don't like the song. I really don't want to do it. And they said, okay, well, we're done with your part. And so Chuck Walters was like, we'll put Phil Silvers into it and give him a moment to at least do one big number. So he gets to do that number at the end with Gene Kelly. And thankfully he did, because if he didn't, we would not have gotten Judy Garland doing Get Happy, which basically came about because they did a rough cut. Chuck Walters looked at the film and he just said, we don't have a big Judy Garland number in this film. She's the star, but she doesn't get a star turn. And so Chuck contacted Judy. She was resting in Carmel, and she said, I'll tell you what I want to do. I just heard Harold Arlen playing Get Happy at a party. I want to do Get Happy. I want you to stage it, and I want to wear the costume from that number that we did in Easter Parade that was cut, and that would have been the little tuxedo jacket and the tights and everything. And Chuck was like, oh, okay, that's a tall order. But Saul Chaplin did the arrangement. Chuck did the choreography. Judy came in and evidently learned everything in no time. They filmed it over 2 days, and within about a week and a half, this sort of masterful number has now been produced, which was really just an afterthought of Judy kind of mentioning to Chuck, I'd like to do Get Happy. And it becomes like really a milestone in her career and MGM's career. And if I may, we would not have had the squeaky board newspaper dance, because after Judy did Get Happy, Gene Kelly was like, well, I really don't have a big number either in this film. And so they kept the summer stock production open for another month and a half for him to invent this absolutely mind-bogglingly gorgeous number where he's, you know, with the squeaky board and the newspaper. And that is what actually was the last thing shot on summer stock. So the reason it ran for so long is only because they didn't quite know what they were doing with the ending final show, and they ended up actually getting a lot greater entertainment by just keeping the shoot open for a while.
And what's strange about that is that all of these three numbers that we're talking about, the Hilly Billy number and Get Happy and the newspaper dance, it all comes in the last half hour. Yeah. Which really elevates the film over the beginning part, I think. Yeah. And I'd like to talk about, there's several things that you brought up, including Arlen and Kohler and how that's different music, but I want to talk about Walters a bit and his use of the camera during the Hillbilly number, because it was such great visual comedy. Essentially all he does is move the camera away from this podium that has dogs, and it's Silvers and Kelly doing the song, and then they pan back over to the podium and suddenly it's got more dogs. They do that about 3 or 4 times, and it's just a great joke every time it happens.
Yeah, it's that one, again, coming from stage, he understood entertainment. And during his years as a choreographer and really finding out what you could do with a camera, the camera, you only have this much. So you are allowed to set up your next gag and then just move the camera over, and it becomes a big ha 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 moment for the audience. And Chuck kept on noticing early on, he was like, you really could do anything with dance on film because the camera allows you to, because the audience is seeing like only so much. Whereas on stage, the audience has a full view of everything. So much of what he was able to do with his camera for that number just comes from his learning and listening and then the timing, basically a good comedic timing of, say, a Charlie Chaplin or a Buster Keaton. It's kind of rooted in dance and choreography and counts. And so the fact that he got that so clearly in that number, that's a Chuck Walters moment. And can I share one of my favorite Chuck Walters moments in it? So there are contemporary musicals. We still do have musicals being produced, and they're all, they're fine. But a lot of times I feel like they're very heavily edited. And sometimes I almost feel to the point that these musicals are created in the editing room. And there's one sequence, and you mentioned the film almost splits in half. There's all this kind of corny barnyard stuff at the beginning, and then it sort of changes midway through. And I think where it starts to happen is with this number called You Wonderful You. And it's about a 5-minute sequence in which Judy comes onto the stage, the lights are kind of dim, and she's just kind of looking around, checking it out. Gene Kelly appears, and he explains to her a little bit about why he loves show business, because Judy's a farmer, she doesn't get it. And then he leads her up on stage, he sings You Wonderful You, and they do a dance to You Wonderful You. And of course, at the end, they kiss, and that's the end of the sequence. What people probably don't realize when they're watching the film, unless you're really paying attention, is that entire 5 minutes of film. 5 minutes of film is a long time. It's done in 3 long takes. Judy walking up onto the stage, cut. Little discussion about show business, cut. And then the entire song that Gene Kelly sings, the entire dance that the two of them does, it's all done in one take. It's 3.5 minutes. And it's just Charles Walters moving his camera around to keep it moving. And what it allows Chuck Walters to do is to allow the performers to really invest in the moment. And you're watching Judy Garland's, she's not singing. She's just listening to Gene Kelly, and you can see she's going through a 3-act play. And you see it, you read it on her face, and it's just this magnificent moment where we as an audience, we're a fly on the wall, watching this very intimate moment that thankfully is not being cut up by the director. And as Chuck Walters liked to say, that he never, if the stars knew how to do it, and obviously he had two of the best musical stars in this film, just let them do it. And basically, it was more magic watching them create magic than whatever could have been done with a stylized camera movement or something that other directors may have tried to insert. So I really, that You Wonderful You moment is just 3.5 minutes of just unadulterated heart, as far as I'm concerned. And it's really the creativity and the trust that Chuck Walters had, and then the talents of Kelly and Garland.
And I believe it's part of the newspaper dance as well, where he's going up and down the stairs that are on the stage. And there's very few cuts in that as well. But it seemed like very logical cuts, and almost that he's changing the lens as Kelly gets up to the top of the stairs to bring you in closer so you can see more of that performance. And then he cuts back when he gets back down the stairs. Really, really interesting.
There's one way of using cuts, especially in a musical sequence, to build excitement. And I know exactly what you're talking about, in that moment where he finally goes up those stairs, and he's so athletic and he's so just full of life at that time, and there's that cut, and the cut comes right on the musical beat, and it takes us as an audience forward, and we get excited too in his energy, and is adding a bit more energy onto his, and that's really the creativity of these master musical creators that knew what they were doing back then on how to really build a musical sequence. And it's that the newspaper dance it's just so perfect. It's perfectly simple, and it's amazingly complicated. And that's what's just so marvelous. He's just using the natural surroundings around him, a squeaky board and a newspaper. I mean, just the inventiveness of that to create a number is enough to sort of be like, wow. And then you just have Gene Kelly, and I feel like, to me, it's my favorite number that Gene Kelly ever did, only because it's so, I feel it's very personal. You always hear about Gene Kelly or Fred Astaire working in the studio by themselves. And here's a chance to really kind of watch him sort of enjoying dancing, but he's not doing it for an audience. He's doing it for himself. Of course, we as the cinema audience, we are privy to it again, that fly on the wall, watching this really intimate moment, which is basically really a wonderful thing for us as the audience to be able to view.
It's really interesting in how small it is too, especially during this period of late 40s to early mid 50s. When you think of Gene Kelly, you think of how athletic and balletic he is with his movements, but this is all very sort of grounded. You know, he's almost always touching the ground. There's no up in the air kind of movement that he's doing. So it's almost contained in a way that it makes me think about that question of choreography between Walters and Kelly, and whether there was some sort of collaboration going on there.
I think in this instance that this was purely Gene Kelly. Chuck Walters, I know, was there. I know that he was working behind the camera, but I'm certain, because Gene Kelly was a great director also. And we shouldn't forget that he was, very much the director for many of his musical sequences, or he worked alongside Stanley Donen. So he understood the camera in a way that other dancers possibly didn't. And so that earthiness that he brings to it, I feel like it's almost autobiographical. You always hear about his wives talking about how they'd wake up in the middle of the night and Gene would be down in the den and he'd be working out a number by himself. And he was earthy, and as opposed to Fred Astaire, who was very light and elegant on his feet. And that sort of anchored to earth. It just kind of like, it brings him into a realm that I think was very relatable for an audience. We have to remember his outfit at that time, also for that number, was these khaki pants and a little like, polo shirt. So he was very much the everyman who was basically trying to get his show up and running. And there he is in the middle of the night because he loves dancing so much, working out a routine and just seeing where his own imagination would take him. It's just a brilliant, brilliant scene. Again, not done with many cuts because he only would cut where he needed to actually change the camera, and always in full body so we could see the whole body, which was an important thing, which they moved away from so quickly when they started having non-musical performers do musicals. We must remember that Judy Garland and Gene Kelly sang, danced, and acted. And we should also mention that as good of a singer as Judy Garland is, she holds her own dancing opposite Gene Kelly in this movie too. She does some pretty outstanding tapping on her own. So that's, yeah.
And moving on to that third number, Get Happy, it's such a change from her character in the rest of the film. I wonder, you mentioned that was the last thing that was, well, it was Kelly, it was the last thing that was shot, but how different the film would be in her denouement as she's, showing her, finding her voice and standing up to her fiance without that number. I think that really encapsulates what that message is about finding her voice, because it was completely different from everything she had shown us before.
Yeah. I mean, even at the time, there were comments in the original newspaper reviews about her fluctuating weight and everything going on. And of course, by the time they did Get Happy, she had lost a great deal of weight, so she looks physically different. But as you're saying, just that emotional moment of her standing there in that rather sexy outfit after being this, very prim and subservient farmer is a big sort of like awakening for her. And the amazing thing, and this is where Chuck Walters comes into play, is that Chuck always said that you have to know the performers better than they know themselves. And that means not only do you have to know what they can do good, but also what are they like inside? How can I communicate with them, and how can I get the best performance out of them? Again, it's that empathetic director that he was, that he could have this empathy with his performers because he was a performer. And so Get Happy, Judy wasn't around during the choreography. Judy didn't have to be there to rehearse that number. Basically, Chuck Walters, he became Judy Garland in the rehearsal. He had the boy dancers around him. And so they choreographed that number in a couple of days. Judy came in. Chuck Walters went through the number. Again, this is her director. I'm sorry, this is not something that, I don't know, Vincent Minnelli would have been doing, where basically Chuck was like, sit down, we're going to do Get Happy for you, and I will play you. And so basically that is something that he would do the number. Judy watched him. She was able to replicate what he did. And that is how she learned Get Happy. The number was recreated a few years later when she went to star at the Palace Theater for her first big one-woman concert appearance, which was staged by Chuck Walters. And again, she relearned Get Happy because Chuck Walters stood there, and we have photographs of him doing Get Happy with Judy watching it. And it's the way that he worked with many performers. He did the same thing with Frank Sinatra, with Bing Crosby and On High Society, teaching them how to move. And they basically had to just mimic what they saw their director doing, which is a very involved way of directing when you really think about it. But yeah, it's that moment where Get Happy shows just how good an MGM musical can be, because they took this song that was 20 years old, that sounded nothing like the arrangement that Saul Chaplin created. You have Judy's voice, and she's at this wonderful, mature part of her development as a singer. And then you have this amazingly energetic choreography by Chuck Walters, which is timeless. And so you put that arrangement, performance, direction, choreography, and camera work all together, and you just have this thing that I forget that Summer Stock is 70 years old. that people are still trying to replicate that that emotion that you get when you watch Get Happy. It's still a number by which other numbers are tested against. So.
The way you talk about Charles Walters, it makes me think maybe a more recent analogy might be Bob Fosse. I can see Bob Fosse doing that, getting in and doing the part so that people can learn it that way.
Yes, Bob Fosse and Gwen Verdon. We should remember that they worked so much as a team, and Gwen was also very good about that. And so was actually Jack Cole, who also was a big choreographer. He worked closely with Marilyn Monroe, and you always see photographs of him doing the number for Marilyn to watch. So again, it's that being a choreographer helped make people better directors. And I think Bob Fosse is a good example in being able to do it. But then, and this is nothing against Bob Fosse, but then he did a lot of editing. And it was kind of something that sabotaged his first movie, Sweet Charity, because people weren't used to that much editing. They were like, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. Or as Chuck said, when Chuck saw Sweet Charity in 1967, the film came out, I believe. And he was good friends with Shirley MacLaine, and he thought that Sweet Charity was terrible because he thought that Bob Fosse had starred himself, that it was all his clever camera work and his clever editing and all of its cleverness, and it took away from watching Shirley MacLaine, who is a great talent. And so he always said that the director should be in the back. The movie has to do with what is happening with the performers and the story. And that is why his career, Chuck Walters' career, is so vast. And you don't really say, oh, this is a Chuck Walters movie because, and pull out little like idiosyncrasies that, you know, maybe a Hitchcock or a Fosse, and you can just tell their movies like that. Chuck Walters are a blur based on the fact that he's trying to present the story and the performer that he had in front of him at the moment. But yeah, he spared no words against Bob Fosse. But then, of course, then Cabaret came out and he changed his tune. So
selfishly, I want to talk about Get Happy, the song. One of the series that I've been planning for a year, and I'm hoping when we get to reopen, we'll be able to do still, is the Great American Songbook, looking at musicals from the songwriters themselves. And the fact that Judy picked this Arlen and Kohler song from 20 years ago, which was different from all of the other songs that were written for the film. So I wondered if you could talk about the songwriters for Summer Stock and how they differ from that.
Yeah, so the film, the music for the film was written by Harry Warren, and he was working with Matt Gordon at this time. And their score is very good. The songs that they wrote, If You Feel Like Singing, Howdy Neighbor on the Tractor, Dig for Your Dinner, they were serviceable songs, but they weren't anything that was going to stand out and become a popular American standard. And I think one of the things that you brought up, it was a 20-year-old song that when it was originally sung sounded nothing like this 1950s arrangement of it, which brought it up to another generation. And then, later it could be up, from that point, then it can continue to grow as the songbook itself grows. And it was an amazing thing that producer Arthur Freed was able to do, if I could use him as an example again, because he started as a songwriter. And he knew enough that starting in the 1930s, he was going to start plugging all of his old songs in his films, to the point of we get to Singing in the Rain, and it's an Arthur Freed production, and the entire score is all Arthur Freed songs that he wrote in the 1920s. But they were then brought back into the 1950s for a whole new audience. And of course, that then translates into another generation, and then on and on and on. So I think it's these musicals that continue to keep the songbook alive, in many ways reminded people of songs that they may have forgotten. Get Happy probably would have been a forgotten song, possibly. But you see it time and time again where an old chestnut is brought out, repolished, and then at that point, at this point, television is starting, so people are starting to go back onto TV, and they're all starting to perform these songs. And then we have the vocalists in the 1960s performing these songs on variety shows. And so they kind of stick with us. And then it becomes this thing where you don't know where the song actually originated from. People would think Singing in the Rain came from Singing in the Rain, when actually it was from the Hollywood Review of 1929, and it had nothing, it didn't make that big of a mark back then. Well, actually, no, it was a hit back then. But so yes, it's because of these movie musicals that we've been able to keep that alive.
Well, this is wonderful. And if there are other Charles Walters films that you haven't mentioned already that you'd like to have people check out, we can do that.
I would say if somebody wanted to find out what he was like, his first film that he directed was Good News, 1947. And it's a charming, fun, fast-paced, you talk about a choreographer's timing, the film flies by. After that, he did Easter Parade, the only time that Judy Garland and Fred Astaire ever worked together, which is a crying shame. It's another one of those movies that flies by because it has a choreographer, director at its helm. A very personal film of Charles Walters is Lily, from 1953, starring Leslie Caron. It's a very, very small, very delicate film that really doesn't fit musical or fantasy or drama or comedy. It's this sort of genre unto itself. And Chuck Walters actually received an Academy Award nomination for Best Director for that film. And I would say lastly, High Society, starring Frank Sinatra, Bing Crosby, Grace Kelly, and Louis Armstrong. It's a film that, if you like that film, you really like that film. I've met people who are passionate. They have families and fathers. It's like almost like the musical it's a musical version of the Philadelphia Story, and it's a musical that it seems like every father seems to like, because Grace Kelly is so beautiful. Bing Crosby is Bing Crosby, and Sinatra, and Louis Armstrong is just a genius. So yeah.
Color me guilty as both a father and one who loves that musical. We played it a couple of years ago on 35 here at the Dryden, and it was great to see it that way.
I would love to see it on the big screen.
Well, we'll schedule it again and have you come back up and introduce it.
All right.
So summer stock for the audience out there is, I believe, if we get this up in time, still on the TCM Watch app. It was showed on TCM recently. If not, it is for rental at most of your digital places, such as Apple TV and Amazon and YouTube, so you can find it there. Thank you, Brent. If you've got a couple of minutes, I've got a short survey that I've been doing with people I've had conversations with. So we'll talk to you about your cinema history.
Sure, and I'll try to make my answers shorter than they were for some reason.
That's good. I think you got one right.
Oh, sorry. That's.
So what is your first cinematic memory?
Strangely enough, it was a musical. When I was 6, I was taken to go see, they were reissuing The Sound of Music in the movie theater. And I think it was the last time it was going to be in a theater before they were showing it on TV. And it became a very, very big deal. I knew nothing about Nazis. I didn't care about a baroness and her captain. I just remember this giant musical film that the light was pouring on me. And it was, I recognize now that I realize when something has universal appeal, is that I was a child and I was relating to the movie because there were children in it. My mother was watching it for another reason. Other people were watching it for another reason. And it was the first time that I recognized, after The Sound of Music, after seeing it, any house that I went to seemed to have the record of The Sound of Music. And so I recognized that it was that movies can bring us all together, and in a way that becomes that we almost have a commonality amongst us as human beings, because we have all seen a particular film or have a fond memory or not a fond memory of a film. Films connect us.
And was there a theater that you went to regularly when you were growing up, a neighborhood theater, one that you have strong memories of?
Unfortunately, no. We moved around a lot, and so there was never a particular film theater. But I will say I did recognize, I'm older, so I remember kind of before cable TV and even before home video, that I used to scour the newspapers wherever we were living to see if there was any classic films being shown. And strangely enough, randomly, Gone with the Wind would be playing at the mall just for 2 days. It wasn't a major reissue, or there would be a James Dean double feature. And so I would have my mother drop me off and I would be able to see these movies, thankfully, the way that they were supposed to be seen on a big screen. And then when I moved to New York when I was 16, we still had revival houses. And those are the theaters that I miss here. It was great to sit with an audience and watch a double feature of films that weren't on video, weren't on late night, the Late Late Show. And it was sitting with a bunch of like-minded film lovers watching something that they haven't seen before. And I will say a quick story. I remember seeing Splendor in the Grass, and the 35mm print was so spliced and so chopped up, and it was such in bad condition that the audience was talking back to the screen through the whole thing because everybody was so excited to see it. And yet we had obviously a 35mm print that probably should not have been projected.
Yeah, scratches are one thing. Too many splices, completely different. Takes you out of the film.
Yeah.
What is your favorite sensory experience going to the cinema?
Sensory experience. I will say it is that sound that comes up with the THX, Dolby, whatever. I know it's been said before by other people you've spoken to. It just is that moment. It's that roller coaster ride that we're all about to go on. It is louder than, I don't know. I live in an apartment, so I can't turn my TV up that loud. My neighbors would be mad, but it's that moment where you're like, oh, this is going to be big and this is going to be fun. And I'm looking forward to this.
Where do you sit when you go to the theater?
In New York, we used to have balconies, like at the Ziegfeld was my favorite theater to go to here. And so I would always sit front row of the balcony center. Nowadays, I will probably try to sit somewhere where I'm not around anybody who likes to take out their phone, because the bright lights, I'm surprised that people do that. So I appreciate sitting center, but if I can't sit center, I'm happy to sit anywhere that is just me and the screen and no distraction.
The last question, and you can't use your own book. Can you recommend a book that people can pick up while they're at home, and either about musicals or about archiving, something that people can read to learn more about film history?
Yes, I would say the Charles Walters book is a good book. It really is looking at a time period, because he started films in 1940, directing films in 1947, and his last film was in 1966. So you see the whole changeover of the studio system to modern Hollywood happening in the book. But the book that I go back to, and it's not even a book, well, he wrote a book, but Ray Edmondson has written so importantly about, again, I'm going to go back to the word ethics that we have in our profession. And he's written a book, I think UNESCO has published a book about ethics, but Ray Edmondson distilled it into a 25-page paper. I believe it's called Audiovisual Archiving, Practice, Philosophy, and Ethics. And it's really it's 25 pages. I read it probably every other year, just because as we move as a profession, obviously, I think Ray wrote this back in the 1990s. So this was back still when film on film was happening. And of course, we've moved so far away from that. And I can't even say we're in the digital world anymore. We're moving into the coding world right now but always going back to, these are our standard principles that we as archivists should adhere to. And it's a reminder that even as the profession grows, there are certain things that don't change. So that's my bedrock. Ray Edmondson, any book, any paper on him talking about the ethics of our profession.
Well, that's a great answer. And it brings us right back to the beginning of the conversation, which is good directing by you.
Full circle. Chuck Walters, he's taught me a lot.
Thank you so much, Brent, for taking the time to sit down with me and having this wonderful conversation. We'll put a link to your book in the notes down here at the bottom of the YouTube video. And if there's anything else you'd like to say, we'll sign off.
No, this was great. The best year of my life was my year at Selznick School. I met the greatest people, you being one of them, and I'm just so thankful that I'm still able to be asked to be a part of these things. So thanks for having me.
Always appreciate it. I hope to get you back up to Rochester sometime soon.
Will do.